Architecture, the use of space, became critical to this project, a point that I made forcefully in my little documentary. One of the first technical treatises on the subject was by none other than Connolly in his The Construction and Government of Lunatic Asylums, which was published in 1847. Here he emphasised issues around the environment. The ideal asylum would be situated in large grounds with low or low-looking walls, with a plentiful supply of fresh, clean air and water. The buildings themselves would be segregated according to sex and type of disturbance experienced by the patient, but inside it would be airy, light, encouraging. Space became an integral part of moral therapy. Of course, throughout the 19th century, the design of these institutions morphed, evolved, transformed. Early asylums like Bodmin were built almost upon panopticon lines, like the idealised prisons of the day, although over time the building would be added to and new structures erected in the grounds. Colney Hatch, the second asylum for the county of Middlesex, constructed a few years after Hanwell, was palatial in its design, a long rambling front and a thin building, kilometres of passages between wards and recreation rooms, large open landscape grounds, although, as this image from the early 20th century shows, like many of these institutions, buildings were added across the grounds as the demands for the services of the asylum increased. And of course you can witness a similar progression elsewhere, for example the evolution of the Norfolk County Asylum. Perhaps one of the more radical shifts in asylum architecture occurred with the introduction of the villa system, which created individual buildings to treat different classes of patients. This remained popular throughout the 20th century. Larundel, near La Trobe, built in the 1840s, was a version of this type of asylum. Go and see it before it's gone. Within the moral therapy regime, and with the enactment of legislation and the expenditure of millions of pounds across the countries of Europe and America, it was argued and indeed legislated that the person in charge, the alienist, must be a medically qualified man, a dramatic transformation from the era of the mad doctor. While the legislation did not prevent non-medical practitioners setting up institutions for the care of the insane, or indeed the just plain unwell, it did ensure that only a medically qualified man could fulfil medical roles within state and parish-connected institutions. This was, in many regards, a symptom of the newfound authority of medicine, epitomised by the triumph of clinical thinking, which from 18th century had been redrawing the map of disease using a combination of pathology and anatomy. Or at least it was a sign that the state accepted the legitimacy of orthodox or identifiable medical practitioners over all others in matters of sickness, mental or otherwise. Whatever the cause, for the next 150 years or more, the asylum remained the principal place of training and practice for medically qualified psychiatrists. But the dream of the therapeutic asylum did not last long. The inflating population seemed to undercut the personalised attention that moral therapy required. Public asylums across the Western world were swamped, full to capacity. Over the course of the 19th century, the numbers rose exponentially, clogging up what were quickly becoming warehouses of the insane. The growth in numbers in British asylums at the beginning of the 20th century, there were over 150,000 patients being treated. That's 20 people per 10,000 of the population, was matched elsewhere. In France, during the 1890s, there were over 108 asylums. In the German-speaking lands, in the same decade, there were over 200 public asylums and a similar number of private ones. The individual bed numbers for asylums towards the end of the 19th century gives us a clear idea of the scale. 2,200 at Colney Hatch and 2,600 at Hanwell. That's 4,800 beds for the county of Middlesex, which, it has to be said, included a large swathe of London. The numbers were often even more dramatic in the USA. At Milledgeville in Georgia, the asylum was expanded from 3,000 to 10,000 beds. Like many other states, Georgia passed its own Lunacy Act, the State Lunatic, Idiot and Epileptic Asylum Act. Milledgeville was opened in 1842. Like Hanwell, the Salpêtrière, or indeed virtually any asylum we care to mention, it had its iconic paternal figure in the form of the superintendent, Dr. Thomas A. Green, who served as resident physician from 1845 to 1879. He did all the things you'd expect of a great alienist. He abolishes physical restraint and runs the institution like an extended family, presiding over the iconic dinner with staff and patients daily. But by 1872, numbers have risen rapidly to the extent that the physician-patient ratio is an untenable 1 to 112. How could one physician exercise authority over that many patients? And then, after 1872, the numbers snowball and the institution becomes primarily custodial. It is extraordinary to think of a graveyard filled with over 25,000 corpses, as at Milledgeville. Many of those 25,000 would have lived an extraordinarily long time within that institution. Of course, David Wright reminds us that for many patients, the length of time spent in the asylum was less than 12 months. Once improved, families would take their own back. The outcome was less certain for those who did not have families to go back to. But there was always a cadre of intractable, incurable patients who could not be cured and could not be discharged, or who had become too institutionalized to be able to cope in the outside world. And it was these that clogged up the system as they aged and died within the walls of the asylum. Similarly, the profession of psychiatry seemed to stagnate within the asylum. To be sure, progressive asylums would always establish a laboratory to attempt to identify the pathological profile of insanity. Typical of these was the West Riding Lunatic Asylum. The institution had been founded in the first flush of moral therapy, but little therapeutic innovation had occurred between then and 1866, when James Crichton Browne, as the new superintendent, established a laboratory and started recruiting the most ambitious young psychiatrists of his day. Two of these reached the summit of their profession, John Hewlings Jackson and David Ferrier. The problem was that it wasn't the profession of psychiatry. Both were what were called solidists. They believed that bodily malfunction, including brain malfunction, was at the root of all psychological disturbance. Hewlings Jackson was a rampant Darwinian, believing that what was often wrong with the individual was a result of his or her evolutionary inheritance. Ferrier was concerned with the nervous system and its part in mental disturbance, and Ferrier and Hewlings Jackson, along with Crichton Browne, the three of them, went on to found the influential journal Brain. To be sure, they also contributed to the Journal of Mental Science, which would go on to become the British Journal of Psychiatry and was really the alienist house journal. But both Hewlings Jackson and Ferrier are better known as neurologists, not psychiatrists. They both abandoned asylum practice for research on the nervous system and its relationship to the brain. They both consulted upon nervous diseases. And uncoincidentally, a very similar thing happened with Henry Maudsley, who was a prominent editor of the Journal of Mental Science and the son-in-law of Connolly. His alienist credentials could hardly have been better. It is an irony, given the trajectory of his career, that the name the Bethlehem Hospital, Bedlam, now possesses is the Maudsley. He gave the institution a bequest, and it rebranded itself. And initially we can see Maudsley thoroughly integrated with the project of the asylum and moral therapy. At the tender age of 23, he's appointed superintendent to the Manchester Royal Lunatic Asylum. That's in 1858. Returning to London in 1862, he married Connolly's daughter and then took over Connolly's private asylum, Lawn House, which he ran until 1874, when he abruptly resigned his position. He went on editing the Journal of Mental Science until 1878, but after that had no more to do with alienism. He would focus instead upon neurology. If you pay close attention to Maudsley's work, The Physiology and Pathology of the Mind, which he published first in 1867, you can see the way that he was going and the way that he was downplaying alienism at the expense of understanding the physiology of the mind itself. In fact, if you have a look at the titles that he has put underneath his name, there's very little about him actually being the superintendent at Lawn House. Now, as we flick through it, we can see more of these problems. You can get this on archive.org yourself. You'll see that he wrote this at the Lawn, that he had sent it off to his publisher in early February 1867. But let's have a look at the contents here. There's the physiology of the mind, the spinal cord reflex action. We're going physiology of the mind, physiology of the mind. We get onto the pathologies, the insanities, and all of that. And look at that. It is only when we get to page 422 out of 442 pages that he gets around to the issue of treatment and in a very, very piecemeal way deals with moral therapy. Why, we might ask, was this the case? All four of the individuals mentioned were the best and the brightest, and yet they all gravitated away from psychiatry towards neurology.